Content warning. This episode makes brief references to drug use and death. Hi everyone, I'm your host, Tom Spare. Welcome to Spare a Thought, the podcast where I focus on the people and organisations whose work often goes underreported or is misrepresented in the media. This is the second of 4 special episodes of the show called Going Spare in the USA. Over the next 4 episodes, I'll be sharing my trip, reflections and the sounds of the 4 cities I visited whilst out in the US in October and November 2024. New York, New Orleans, Atlanta and Washington DC. 4 episodes, 4 cities in 1 presidential election. This is Going Spare in the USA, Part 2, The Big Easy. It's the 28th of October 2024. After breakfast at Friedman's on 72nd Street, I took in a bright, warm October morning and headed to Brooklyn Fair, an organic produce store close to my hotel. I was buying snacks before a taxi ride to Newark Liberty International Airport. I'd be flying to New Orleans that afternoon. The place was crammed full of fresh produce, a maze of healthy treats and upmarket items. I bought some fresh fruit and a vitamin ginger shot. It was a half-hearted attempt to pep myself up after a busy few days. The jet lag was yet to pass, and I'd clocked up 40,000 plus steps over the previous couple of days. As I exited the store, a man was crouched down in a squat on the sidewalk, swaying. He had a slim, near skeletal frame. His clothes were careworn. I noticed a used needle by his side. This would be the first of many jarring experiences that I would witness on my trip. I was trying to rationalise the scene, but the thing spinning around in my brain was this. I had just bought some healthy snacks and a ginger vitamin shot from the organic store. The guy I was looking at had just injected himself with heroin. That image of the man crouching stayed with me. I'd seen far more homeless people the second time round of visiting the US. I'd seen far more people struggling. Whilst the FTSE 100 companies were notching up ever greater records in share value, everyday Americans were burdened with debt, working multiple jobs, forced into poverty, homelessness and addiction. From my first visit in 2022 to 2.5 years later in 2024, I was noticing the other side of the coin. I headed back to the hotel, disturbed, packed up my suitcase and waited for a pre-booked taxi to collect me outside. I arrived at Newark Liberty International Airport with about 2.5 hours to spare. That afternoon I'd be flying out to New Orleans, Louisiana, over 1,300 miles from New York. The airport was light, modern, and easy to navigate. There was a gate change. I was in the wrong part of the airport, but eventually got to where I needed to be. This was my first internal flight in the US. The plane was full. I was in the wrong seat. You can see a pattern here. I found the correct seat on the opposing aisle and ended up by the window. We took off, I watched as New York disappeared, and we rose high into the sky. I was impressed with the comfort of the internal flight operated by United Airlines. Plenty of leg room, comfortable seats, a friendly flight crew. And despite being thousands of feet in the air, I was surprised to find out I could access WhatsApp. I messaged my partner and a couple of friends. The novelty of sending a message so far away from home and so far away from the ground lasted the whole trip. There are corners of my flat where my phone reception cuts out, and yet here I was sending messages to loved ones on that same phone, thousands of feet in the air, crossing the length of the United States. When we landed in New Orleans, the passengers of flight UA 1343 and I were off the plane swiftly. The gate was filled with passengers ready to take our place. I headed for the exit via the travel information desk. A bubbly lady directed me to the bus. I briefly asked her about Taylor Swift's 3 nights residency at Caesars Superdome, performing close to 200,000 people over her stay in the city. If memory serves me correctly, The member of staff said her daughter went to one of the gigs and had an amazing time. I'd seen in the media that Taylor Swift fans were so overwhelmed by the experience of seeing their idol, they had little to no recollection of the concert itself. This was not a small number of incidents. This was hundreds of fans reporting that they had very little memory of the experience. So in awe, so overwhelmed, their memories had been wiped. They had a blank space where Taylor's show should have been. Wild. As I left the airport, I noticed a multicoloured balloon sign on the main airport building spelling out Taylor Swift. Everything was so much bigger in the US. The food, the buildings, the welcome, the celebrities. New Orleans, shortened to NOLA, is often called the Crescent City. It was founded by the French in 1718. Over the years, it became a melting pot, transitioning from French to Spanish control before finally becoming part of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. This blend of influences left an indelible mark on the city's identity, from its architecture and food to its customs and celebrations. You can still see the French influence in the cuisine, while the Spanish colonial period gifted the city its famous wrought iron balconies and colourful facades. This unique mix of early cultures set the stage for everything that was to come. That initial cultural fusion only deepened over time. The French and the Spanish influences blended with African traditions brought by enslaved peoples. Later, waves of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and the Caribbean further enriched this diverse urban mosaic. I boarded a bus that took me from Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport into the city centre. The bus rattled along the Interstate 10 East-West Highway. In the distance, I could see the Caesars Superdome. The bus came to a sudden halt near the city centre, the doors flung open. All on board exchanged a confused look. The driver stuck out his head from the seat. End of the line. Everyone off. This was not the scheduled stop I'd anticipated. I was under the impression the bus would take me deeper into the city centre, closer to my Airbnb. Unfortunately, I was left on the sidewalk with my case as the bus sped away, heading back to collect another shipment of confused passengers. I ordered an Uber. 5 minutes later, a souped-up car drew in. The driver's door opened, and out he climbed. He said to me, "Tom, that's me." I nodded. I gestured to the boot. "Nothing goes in the boot. You have to put your luggage on the back seat," he said. So I climbed into the Uber and dragged in my luggage, wondering what was in the driver's boot. It turned out the driver's name was Thomas. He pulled away from the bus stop. After a few moments, he glanced over his shoulder. "How do you say your name?" he asked me. "My name?" I suddenly thought, wait, has he got the wrong passenger? "Well, it's Tom," I said. "Tom," he repeated. "And how do you say your full name?" "Thomas," I replied. "Thomas," he repeated. "Ah, I see. Thomas." The confusion on my face must have shown. "I wanted to know how your name and my name sounded in your accent," he laughed. As we sped through the streets of New Orleans, houses flying past my window, Thomas took out his phone and started picking his fantasy football team. I gripped onto my seatbelt a little tighter. We flew over speed bumps, my stomach flying with the vehicle. Thomas swerved a few times as he was multitasking. "Damn," he would say. He would tut and shake his head. "Okay, not the best." We came to a sudden stop. The doors unlocked and I woozily climbed out of the car. Thomas helped me with my bag and sped away. I was grateful still to be in one piece. A siren wailed a couple of blocks away. I fumbled my phone out of my bag and checked I had the correct address. My Airbnb was right in front of me. A small extension, perhaps a former garage, now a tiny guest house. I struggled to open the door. The latch and the key seemed overly complex to my tired mind. The sirens grew closer, my heart started to race, and I found myself losing patience with the key. Eventually I managed to get the right combination and the door was open. I tumbled into my Airbnb. The sliding door kept opening despite my best attempts to keep it on the latch. The sirens grew even closer, and an emergency vehicle sped down the road, lights flashing past me. I drew the door closed and collapsed onto a small sofa filled with relief. It was getting dark by this point. I was shattered. My Airbnb was small, lots of wood, a cabin more than a room. It had a microwave, a little fridge, a sink, shower, toilet, and above me, a mezzanine, accessible via a small ladder with metal rungs. It took me a lot of effort to climb into the bed, and I felt a little faint looking down at my descent. After a rest, I headed out to explore my local neighbourhood. Just down the street was St. Roch Market, an indoor market with food vendors and a bar. There was little street lighting between my Airbnb and the market. I was a little jumpy, exhausted and overwhelmed. Before reaching the market, I passed St. Roch's Tavern, which looked like something straight out of a Grand Theft Auto game. I walked up to what I thought was the main entrance, but the door wouldn't open. Some revellers were outside smoking. I didn't attempt to engage with them. The light was dim, so I skipped away and retreated to the market. Inside St. Roch Market was a bright space with white columns and a selection of food vendors down either side. After my pacing walk to the venue, I calmed myself a little bit before exploring the food options. Quite a few of the vendors had closed. It must have been close to 9 p.m. In the end, I picked a guy who was selling gumbo. Gumbo is a traditional New Orleans dish, a stew often containing chicken or seafood, served with rice. The gumbo served to me was thick, filled with an assortment of seafood, prawns, oysters and vegetables. The guy serving me was older. He had a craggy face and messy hair. He wore an apron and operated in a very small space. He moved around clanging pots and swiftly served my meal. I sat opposite him on a stool. The gumbo was flavoursome and heavy, exactly the sort of meal I needed after a frantic couple of hours of travel. A quiz concluded as I ate my meal, and when I was finished I moved along to the market bar. I took a seat at the bar, interrogated the drinks menu and was served by a guy called Whitney, a local in the area. The next day, the 29th of October 2024, it was hot, 30 degrees, and humid. I dragged myself out of the Airbnb. Daylight revealed St. Roch to be quite the opposite to the anxiety-inducing dark street it had been the previous night. It was full of pastel-painted shotgun shacks and cottages, with verandas and small fences. I passed St. Roch Tavern, the market, and crossed St. Claude to the southern end of Frenchman Street. It was here I ate at the Frenchman all-day restaurant, sampling red beans and rice. The beans were served up in a salty sauce in which were mixed sliced smoky sausage with a dollop of rice on top. It was too warm to do much else, so I retreated to my Airbnb and rested. In the early evening I strolled towards the French Quarter and picked a bar at random to sample some local music. The place I stumbled upon was BMC Balcony Music Club. Because it was early, there were very few customers. I took a seat as a three-man band played. That was the sound of Jeff, Chaz and band. I got chatting to him between sets. He flogged me a CD. I hung around a little longer afterwards. When I returned to my Airbnb, I realised I didn't have a CD player at home, so I found Jeff on Spotify instead. It was still quite early. I returned to St. Roch Market. Whitney was working that night too. He recognised me from the night before. He was more open second night round, told me about his family growing up in New Orleans, and made up some drinks for me. A couple from North Carolina joined me at the bar. We got chatting. It turned out they'd been on a US-wide road trip travelling across the states to Las Vegas for the guy's parents' wedding anniversary. The couple had planned the trip to make the journey in their motorhome, but the timing had been fortuitous. At the end of September, Hurricane Helene had struck in the Carolinas, with flooding sweeping away entire neighbourhoods and communities. The couple had left shortly after the flooding, their house without water or electricity. A month later, they were still on their road trip and had recently received word that power was back on in their property, but the water was still not safe to drink. New Orleans was a stopover, and they hoped by the time of their return that the water would be drinkable again. It turned out the couple had a link to the UK. The wife had studied in Chester for a 6-month exchange whilst at university. My conversation with the couple included Whitney, and we covered a whole range of topics, including US politics and the UK and the government response to the hurricane. Trump, they said, was making spurious claims about the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and their response to the hurricane. The couple had nothing but praise for the agency. Following day, it was the 30th of October, I checked out of my Airbnb and I ate at St. Roch's Market for a final time. I sampled some grits with toast, eggs and bacon. Grits is a type of porridge typically cooked in water or milk. It's a staple of Southern cuisine. After my final meal, I took an Uber to my apartment. It was my first experience of a Sonder apartment. These are usually rooms within blocks of flats or hotel complexes. I went from a tiny Airbnb to a huge apartment in the centre. The place had aircon, a kitchen with a large fridge, clothes washing facilities, a large TV, bathroom and bedroom. I ventured up to the roof, which had a small pool and a panoramic view of the city. It was tempting to spend the rest of the evening in the apartment, but eventually I willed myself outside. I ate at Red Fish Grill, a recommendation from Marina at work. I had the speciality dish, although alligator was on the menu. The restaurant sat at the start of Bourbon Street, the tourist trap and most famous of New Orleans' lively streets. The sky was darkening, the neon lights were buzzing, and the early evening revelers streamed into the bars, restaurants and clubs on the Strip. During my several days of staying in New Orleans, I saw little that would indicate a consequential presidential election was taking place. However, every now and then the election would pop up like a glitch in the Matrix. I visited an oyster bar. Inside the venue, the World Series was playing on the screens. The New York Yankees were battling it out with the LA Dodgers. During the breaks, a sequence of adverts would arrive. It would go weight loss drugs, insurance, kitchen hack devices, campaign ads. The most frequent ads were endorsing Donald Trump. After this sequence ended, a normal service would resume. For a country that preached the gospel of democracy, New Orleans was election agnostic. Bourbon Street was seedier than I expected. Lots of drinks were overpriced for what they were, but the music was excellent. The 31st of October, Halloween. On my final day in NOLA, I had two objectives: to go to the Jazz Museum and to frequent a dedicated jazz bar. I did not take the most direct routes and found myself wandering aimlessly through side streets. I restocked my energy for a late breakfast at a Greasy Spoon in the centre before heading to the promenade. It was here I happened across a national park site, nestled in a courtyard. A group of older jazz players had been convened by the US National Parks to conduct a performance. They played a piece of music written to celebrate the day. It was called the Halloween Blues, and it went like this. After the musical interlude, I headed east along the promenade, passing Jackson Square. Nearby, horse and carts were lining the road, ready to fleece unsuspecting tourists. Eventually, I reached the Jazz Museum. Lots of the museum was closed off due to renovation. However, I enjoyed walking through the exhibitions and learning about the late great Louis Armstrong. Armstrong was born into a music scene that melded and mixed French, Spanish and West African culture, creating Creole culture. From that culture came a unique sound. That sound was jazz. The music grew out of the city's unique blend of African drumming from places like Congo Square, the call and response chanting of Mardi Gras Indians, and the popular brass marching bands of the day. A crucial moment came when the formally trained Creole musicians and the improvisational uptown African-American musicians began to collaborate. fusing their styles. This powerful mix of discipline and spontaneous rhythm created the polyphonic sound of early New Orleans jazz. And of course, the music was forever changed by the great Louis Armstrong, who shifted the focus from a group effort to the stunning, expressive power of the solo artist. Following my trip to the Jazz Museum, I headed back towards St. Roch in search of lunch. As I headed towards the supermarket on St. Claude Street, I noticed a collection of emergency vehicles, including an ambulance and police cars. None of the emergency staff seemed to be in a rush. They had semi-cordoned off an area nearby, and my gaze lowered to the road. A man lay face first in a puddle, dead. I felt numb, my brain struggling to process the calmness of the scene around me, the relaxed nature of the emergency services and the still, rigid body. That man, a stranger to me, had once lived, and now he was gone, left with an undignified end for strangers to pass him. The sight of the body shook me to my core. I had no idea what to do, so I carried on with my plan, found some lunch at the supermarket, ate inside away from the heat and the body. Afterwards, I crossed the road and bought a copy of The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates from Baldwin & Co. Coffee and Bookstore. I walked back to my apartment, the body still at the forefront of my mind, another jarring moment that was difficult to process. Later that evening, I headed to Mahogany Jazz Hall to conclude my trip in NOLA. The staff wore Halloween costumes and I finally got to listen to some jazz. In the next episode of Going Spare in the USA, I take an epic train journey from New Orleans to Atlanta, taking in the Carter Presidential Center and the Martin Luther King National Park.
Citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our...
Thanks for listening to Going Spare in the USA. I'm Tom Spare. I wrote, edited and produced this episode. Additional editing by Emily Merry. The music is by Wondershare for Mora. This has been a Be The Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening.